Hello everyone, this is Dr. Song of New Covenant Academy. In this podcast, we're going to be addressing a very, very sensitive and difficult topic of grief. Grieving and having difficulties with the loss of a loved one is not an easy topic to address. But in recent weeks, I had to wrestle with it. And I also know that in addition to my personal experience, we're seeing the passing of loved ones in the lives of our staff, our parents, and our students. Researchers tell us that the three most traumatic experiences of young people, children and teenagers, is loss of a loved one, and school change, and move. Now, I can't do much about parents moving homes or switching schools, but grief and losing a loved one for students, whether they be parents, because we even have students at our school who lost their parents in recent months, to losing grandparents, uncles, and relatives, is a very, very difficult time. So today, I have Pastor Ted here with me, who has not only experienced his own personal grief with the loss of a family member, but also as a pastor, he has been in the middle of helping and counseling others, whether they be students or church members or friends. So I want to bring that unique perspective into this as well. Pastor Ted, typically, we talk about stages of grief. They say that the 5 stages of grief are denial. Are you kidding me? Is this real? To anger. How could it be? To bargaining, like, well, there's got to be some silver lining. There's got to be something that's good. Try to make sense of the situation. And then they go into personal depression. It's like when the loss settles in, it leads to some grievance and depression, and then there's the last stage, which is full acceptance and moving on. So when my brother passed away suddenly, about a week and a half ago, when I received a text message saying that, hey, your brother is gone, I actually said, I looked at my phone and I said, no, can't be. I just saw him yesterday at church. No, this must be a wrong message. There's a little bit of a denial going on. Have you seen this in others and maybe in yourself and when you were dealing with grief?
Yes, everybody has experience with grief, right? Who hasn't had a loved one pass on? And I don't think everybody goes through those in successive order. I know, like, sometimes, especially when young people die, there's a denial that happens. But then again, I wanted to point out the fact that grief is something that needs to happen almost, because I think it's a way to get on the other side of grief. So oftentimes, like when I go visit people, with my church members, when somebody has passed on, and people mean well, and they go, oh, it's okay, there's a silver lining and all these things. But I think those things has to be processed, and sometimes you have to wallow in those situations. But definitely, I think all those reactions are appropriate, if not needed, I think. And in my experiences with seeing families and church members and people through the grieving process, I don't think anybody can say, hey, for your anger, here's an antidote, or for your depression, here's an antidote. I think as human beings, God's created us to love life and cherish life. So when that's lost, there is a natural grieving that has to happen and does happen. But one of the things that I really want to talk about in this subject is, if you know God, you certainly do grieve, but you don't despair. And I think that's the hope, right? That I can grieve, but we don't despair. And I feel bad for people who don't know God, because there's nothing beyond the grief.
So
Yeah.
I know that we need to get to that.
Yeah.
I know that we need to get to that. But I think we're at an age where we go more to funerals than we go to birthday parties or
Sure.
weddings and such. And at our age, we are already experiencing the passing of loved ones at our age level, and almost all of my parents are gone.
Sure.
Many of my dad's generation is no longer around. People who are born in the 30s and 40s, 1930s and 1940s, different decade, a different century. So we are more aware of what death is.
Yeah.
And theologically, and as a persons of faith, we know what death means as a passing to the next stage of the eternal or the eternal life. But when we talk about young people going through grieving, young people, say middle school, high school, and even children who lose their grandparents and uncles and aunts, they go through shock, do they not? I mean,
No.
it's almost like we hear this perennial question, right? Which is, why is this thing happening to good people? Why is this horrible thing called death occurring to my parents who are good parents, or my uncle who was a good person, or my grandparents who are good? I think there's, whether they're believers or not, if they're immature in faith and they're young in age, I think they could actually have anger toward God, because God's allowing this to take place.
Yeah, I can speak from my personal experience. My father's passed on, my mother has. My father passed relatively young. I know your father passed even younger.
Yes.
My dad was in his early 70s, and nowadays people live quite a long time. And my personal experience was I needed to take care of the family, but we were talking about young people. My youngest son at the time, I think, was about 6 years old. I think he had just started school here at NCA. I think it was in the first grade. And, we're busy, doing the funeral and all these things. And I didn't realize that even a 6-year-old has his emotion.
Right. Crying.
Yeah. And I have two boys. And the older one, who was about 10 or 11, didn't have much emotion. But John was pounding the ground crying, like going
Over Grandpa's death.
over Grandpa's death, which kind of took me back a little bit, because I was thinking, it just sounds funny, but he's only known him for 6 years.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it would, but it took a long time to walk with John to have him go through that process. He was angry. He was like, why my grandpa?
Yeah.
Why not somebody else's?
Or why now? Why now? Why not later?
So I remember one thing that he said is that he calls his older brother Hyunga, that's the Korean for older brother. He goes, Hyunga got to enjoy Grandpa,
Right.
and I don't have a lot of experience with him.
Well, that's exactly how I felt, because I'm the youngest of the four brothers, and when my dad passed away, when he was only 68 years old, I was early 30s, and my oldest brother was already in his 40s, and I'm like, they got to enjoy him and even be good to him, because I'm starting out in my life with limited resources, whereas they've already established themselves, and they could be a greater blessing to my parents than I was able to, and I felt that was unfair. And I'm like, why would God not give me a little more time with my parents? So maybe in a nutshell, John may have felt the same thing. It's like, I didn't get to really enjoy my grandfather.
Yeah, so that was it surprised me, honestly. So I spent some time with him, and I was a pastor to him more than just to that. And even at 6 years old, he knew about faith and salvation, and he knew Grandpa was in a better place. But he didn't want to hear your grandpa's in a better place, because I'm in a rotten place. And it's even a little emotional thinking about, a little child going through that. But even for me, as you spoke, even for me, my father passed, not suddenly, but relatively suddenly. He didn't have a long illness, He did go through cancer, but a lot of regret. So for John, it was more anger. For me, a lot of regret about.
Regret in the sense what? I could have been better to him.
Oh, absolutely.
I could have been more respectful. Maybe I should have spent more time with him.
Well, for me, when I was an adult, I was better to him. Like, I matured and I was.
Do you want to go there, right? You want to discuss your wild days in your youthful years?
Sure. I mean, just to touch upon it, gave a lot of grief in my youth to my father. And one of the things that I was really glad to do, because my father passed away of a stomach cancer, so we knew he was passing, I got to say sorry, and that was tough.
Yeah.
Because, you just glossed it over.
Yeah.
Like, it was understood that I messed up and Dad, you forgive me. But towards the end of his life and the last few weeks, when I know that time was really coming, I got to say sorry.
Yeah.
And
well, I know I sound like I'm trying to one up on Pastor Ted, but my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and had died within 45 days of the diagnosis. So we couldn't even get a second opinion scheduled because it took 2 months for UCLA to schedule somebody.
Right.
And I never even got to even process that because my father was one of those quintessential Asian men, who expressed his love through sacrifice and devotion rather than with words of affirmation, or like tenderness, So, boy, there is a lot of regret, but also it subsides over time, does it not? Because I think we're going to have to turn this into a 2-session episode. We're going to talk about how grieving biblical versus unbiblical or non-biblical, or maybe grieving for believers versus non-believers, and possibly guide our parents and students as to how to grieve, perhaps even age appropriately or situational appropriately, because passing of a loved one in your family versus maybe extended family versus your neighbor, you're going to have a different depth of emotion. But I want to go back to that part about regret. I think remorse or regret of how you left the relationship, or how the passing of the loved one kind of left the relationship, whereas maybe there were constantly a reminder in your heart as to, I should go say hello, I should spend more time with him or her, or I should say thank you more. I mean, when my parents passed away too, there was a lot of grief that came out. Maybe I wasn't as wild as Pastor Ted was in high school, but
I wasn't that wild.
Oh, you weren't that wild. Okay, maybe I was even wilder. But boy, I was not a good child to, I think, especially to my mother, because I had a lot of conflicts with my mom, because my mom was a tiger mom, one who asked me to stay focused on school and education, and I was playing football, and I was athletic, I was doing all these things at school. Maybe in her mind, I was running with the wrong crowd. And I had a lot of differences. And I particularly remember one moment when I got really, really angry at my mom for her really like trying to talk sense into me. And I pulled out of the driveway, screeching and just taking off. It's almost like an expression, like telling her, like, I don't want to listen to you. I'm angry at you, probably uttering, some words that I should not be speaking. And I look back and I said, how could she put up with me? How could she still love me? And as I have my own children in my life, and I go through, our kids are all grown up, but we had the rebellious stage of our children, and you start to understand the father's heart, mother's heart about how to be patient with the child. And I so regretted having been disrespectful to my mom. as well as to my dad. So that there's that kind of remorse.
Yeah. So for me, in every close death I had, my biggest grieving was the remorse, the regret. Even with my mother, so for my father, it was silver lining in the death because we knew he was passing. So I got to spend a lot of time and do things. But on the flip side of the coin, in my mother's case, she lingered on, she last almost 5 years of her life was inside the convalescent hospital.
Yeah. Very similar to my mother.
And then for my mother, Corona hit. And during Corona, we couldn't visit her for a couple of years,
right.
live, face to face. And during that time, her dementia got pretty intense. So the regret was not being good to her. So for my father, it wasn't like, oh, I wasn't good to him. It was more, I'm sorry. For my mother, I felt bad that she spent the last 3 years of her life basically in jail, with her sons visiting, but only through a glass. And the last year of her life, she was robbed of her memory.
Yeah.
Not remembering,
So this remorse could potentially turn into anger at yourself. You're frustrated that you weren't good enough, or you weren't good, or you weren't there.
Yeah.
So it's not only anger at God, as a lot of young people would feel, but when you grow older, I think, especially parents or adults who are watching this video might be saying, I felt bad about myself because I wasn't there, I wasn't good enough. And then this kind of ties into the third stage of grief they talk about, which is bargaining. They're like, what if? What if, oh boy, had I done that? Had I been there? Had I treated them this way, it could have been better. So I think it's really like pointing fingers at yourself and saying, what role did I have in this passing? And what could I have done? Right? What I didn't do. It's a remorse and guilt. I think guilt could be another way to express to label that remorse.
Dr. Song, you're rekindling a lot of. I might cry during this podcast. So certainly my parents' passing were probably the most impactful death. But one other death in my life that was really impactful was when I was 16 years old. One of my best friends took his own life. And 16 is when I became really a Christian. I went to church all my life. But at 16, I come to know Jesus. The Bible came alive. But like I said, I wasn't the best child in the world. So I was hanging out with more rough crowd. And my best friend was no angel. So I was making up my mind and kind of psyching myself up to witness Jesus to these guys. Because it's hard, like, when you've been doing stupid stuff together, to talk about Jesus.
All of a sudden, yeah.
So I was working up my courage to, come out as a Christian, kind of. But still the vices of young age, I was still participating in, like teenage drinking and hanging out and carrying on. So the background is that my friend was one of the kids in our friends group that was well-to-do. All of our other friends, we didn't have two nickels to rub together. And his parents had bought him, Dr. Song, you remember, 1982 Toyota Celica.
Why do you have to mention that?
That is...
Because that's a car that I actually had.
See? He's a rich guy right here. Huh?
No. My dad bought them for my older brothers, and after they got into a few accidents, it was passed on down to me.
Okay. So
Full disclaimer.
He had a brand new Toyota Celica. And young people, those who don't know, that was a car.
That was a hot car.
He had it. And I know a lot of you guys think, a lot of young guys, if only I had a car, if only my parents would give me more freedom, if only if I had a girlfriend who was pretty. And he had all those things. He was the envy of everybody, basically. And he had a good best friend, right? So the night that he took his life, Friday night, we went to Santa Monica Beach, where we always go, and it was winter time, and there's nobody around, and Dr. Song would know there's huge parking lots right on the beach. So we parked in there, and we did some underage drinking. Don't recommend it. And we talked about stuff that teenagers talk about, right? The meaning of life, the existential questions that you ask, and all that. And I wanted to talk to him about Jesus that night, but the moment never materialized. And we came home, he dropped me off at my house, and he went home. And the next day, one of my other friends comes to my house, because we didn't have, cell phones or anything. Then he goes,
So-and-so's.
Did you hear? He took his own life. I said, shut up. What
Wow.
are you talking about? I was with him last night. And he said, yeah, that's why he came, because I know you were the last one to see him.
Yeah.
And they asked me, did he tell you anything? He must have told you something. You guys are thick as thieves. He didn't say a single word. Not one word.
So even though you may have been the closest of friends, there's another dimension or a layer to his pain and what he was grieving over.
And his parents asked me, did he tell you anything?
Yeah.
He didn't write a single note.
Wow.
He didn't tell his girlfriend. He didn't tell me. He didn't tell anybody. And that's one of the driving forces of me being a pastor. I don't want to lose a moment of being able to tell somebody about Jesus, because you never know when that last chance is.
Yeah.
And I made it through. I'm still emotional. I think about it from time to time.
Yeah.
And I wonder, God, because if you were to ask me, is he in heaven? I'm not God, so I can't say for sure.
Yeah.
But as far as I know, he didn't know Jesus.
Right. And that's
so.
And that kind of takes us to the next part, which I think we're going to have to spend some time more deeply on the second episode related to this topic. So there's that denial stage, and there's the anger and frustration and remorse, and you're in this bargaining stage. You're talking about what if, what could I have done? And I know it still is hard for you. This sheer raw emotion that we feel over our loved ones passing does subside. But isn't it true that somewhere, sometime, whether it's the food that you shared, whether it's the restaurant that you visited together, whether it's a place that your parents or your friend or me with my parents have gone to somewhere, something rekindles that emotion in us. So the sheer volume of tears and emotional grief does wane and subside, but once in a while, boom, it just pops up, doesn't it? When I face a certain dish that my mom used to make for me, and it was a specialty that not a whole lot of others could make, I just see it and I smell the food and I go, Mom. And there's just this tear just wells up, right? And that happens to all of us. Like I said, the volume of tears and the frequency will just gradually die out. But I think whenever we lose a loved one, we lose part of ourselves that probably never comes to 100% healing. The pain is there.
Yeah, I think I would phrase it like the tear is not so grief-stricken, but it's a sad emotion. Like you said, you and I walk
very
much
similarly,
the same path. So some people might think, well, your dad's been passed on for 16, 17 years. How much remorse do you have? Even my wife. Sometimes I'd be melancholy and she goes, what's wrong? Because I'm normally not like that. I said, I simply tell her I miss Dad.
Yeah. Or sometimes you say like, I wish Dad were here. I wish I have someone to talk to.
Yeah. So So even my wife doesn't understand the grief that I go through, even after so many years. It happens to me when I see my sons growing up.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize, but what my father must have felt when he saw me at that stage. So that and as far as like you talking about your mom's food, that happens to me as well. I'm still looking for that chicken dish that my mom made that nobody can replicate, right? But one thing that is a happy, emotional thing that I do is, some of you guys may be watching, when I do like a day trip for seniors or graduates or rewards, I take them to Manhattan Beach. Right, Charlie, who's behind the camera, he knows I go there. When I go there, there's a natural high I have, because that's where my father used to fish.
That's right.
And there's a corner of the pier where he fished, there in Hermosa Beach. And my father told me when he was in his last week and we were in the emergency room together, he says, "When I die, I don't want you to come to my grave." And he said, "I'm not there. If anything, if you value me, then go fish at that point that I used to fish." And he told me, "Don't drop the weight all the way to the bottom, just about 10 feet, and hook you." I mean, he was a fisherman. Do it that way and catch fish. I don't fish that much, but I went a couple of times and I did what he said, and I caught a couple of fish, and I remember saying, "Thanks, Dad," and I still reminisce. Matter of fact, I was out there. I didn't tell my wife or anything. I went out to the pier where he used to go and spend some time. Teared up a little bit. That's still grief in a way.
So I think people could who are watching this video could see the raw emotion that is associated with grief, and how that emotion lingers on. And it could come up once in a while. Just a thought, just a smell, just a place, just even looking at old photos, right?
Sure.
And so as we wrap up this episode of our podcast on grief and how we should grieve well, I hope that the viewers could recognize that there are certain stages of grief. It may not be in a specific order, but typically it comes in a pattern, and then there's that denial. I can't believe that so and so has passed away. To remorse, like what could I have done? To being angry at yourself or God, or why is this happening? Why is bad thing happening to good people? We could ask all these questions. And one thing I know, and I think Pastor Ted would agree, that God is big. So he could handle all of our questions, all of our frustrations. And yes, there is a way to grieve properly. There is a way to grieve biblically, which we're going to talk about in the next session. I'm not a big fan of TV shows, but when we were growing up, there was a very famous sitcom called Family Ties. Do you remember, with Michael J. Fox?
Yes.
And there was one episode that shocked the daylights out of me, which was like an hour-long episode. It's called The Death of Gregor. Death of Gregor. It was when Michael J. Fox, the main character, lost his best friend, almost like what you said. They went out together, and on their way home, Michael J. Fox gets dropped off or something like that. He comes inside his house, but in the short moment of time, his best friend dies in an accident. And he goes through this monologue, almost like a stage presence from one part of the stage to another, where he's talking to himself and he's imagining talking to Gregor, and he's recalling, and he goes through this grief process. He was in denial, and he was feeling remorseful, like, why wasn't I there? Why wasn't I the one who was killed? And why was it him? Because he's really a better person than I am, kind of a feeling. And anger, pounding at the floor, pounding the chest of his mom and dad and himself, like thinking, all of that. So I don't know if that video would be available online, but if you could find something, I think this would be a great episode called Family Ties with Michael J. Fox and Death of Gregor. Do you have another program you want to say before we end
No,
this?
no. I just wanted to mention that the character's name is Alex P. Keaton.
Alex P. Keaton, that's right.
Reminds me of Dr. Song.
No.
Yes.
Okay, so...
Watch it. Reminds you of Dr. Song. Smart guy, knows economics like no other, right?
I don't know if that was the right closure to this session, but this episode. But we laugh knowing something that non-believers don't, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode of how to grieve and how to grieve well. Recently, we've heard of one of our students' dad passing away about 6, 7, 8 months ago. To a couple of years ago, one of our students in college graduating from our school and passing away. To recently to my brother. To I think another one of our students had a grandmother passed away, whose funeral is coming up. All these things are part of life that we're going to have to go through. There's no one who's going to escape this event or this crisis. We're all going to go through that. And so it's best that we share our experience with our audience, our school community, and let them know that there is a way to grieve, and there is a way to grieve well, and that for those who may not know how to grieve well, such as young people and our students, and maybe some of our parents as well, we need to help them understand that by sharing our experience, that they get a little bit of a glimpse of how to grieve well and how to process this, so that ultimately they'll be able to go on with their life. So I want to thank Pastor Ted for joining me, and please come back for the next episode where we talk about what does biblical grief looks like. And also I want to talk to Pastor Ted about a very serious topic, which is, have you ever witnessed the passing of a non-believer as a pastor? And how do you reconcile that with faith and the loved ones who are grieving, maybe people who are family members who are still alive, who are of Christian faith, or maybe they're atheists or non-believers. What hope can we give them? That will be the topic of our next episode. So thank you very much for joining us. This is Dr. Song and Pastor Ted of New Covenant Academy. God bless you, and stay tuned and come back for the next episode.